Today, more than ever, Ukraine appears to be a stage on which a whole series of non-Ukrainian actors are performing more or less obscene vaudeville acts that have nothing to do with the security or the well-being of that hapless country and its citizens.
Trump is asking some of the right questions. Sometimes he may even get some of the right answers, but he's asking the question which should have been asked far more firmly 30, 40 years ago. What is the point of NATO?
I think Trump's decided that that conflict with Ukraine and Russia is lost.
Hello and welcome to the 42nd Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that examines the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our time. I'm your host, Radhika Desai, and working behind the scenes to bring you our show every fortnight are our videographer, Paul Graham, our transcriber, Eklavya Jain, and our host, Ben Norton. Headlines in the liberal press about President Trump's Ukraine policy are probably running out of expletives and superlatives. President Trump is leaving Ukraine out to dry, or hanging Ukraine out to dry, rather. He's changing sides in the conflict. He's destroying NATO. He's dismantling the post-Second World War order. The list could be much longer. It seems, however, that the most important thing to know when reading these headlines is that the liberal press wants to paint President Trump as the devil incarnate. And President Trump just loves to play that role. So this tango of provocation and vilification will likely continue for some time, and we must learn not to be mesmerized by it. Indeed, we need to look through it. We need to understand how the deliberate exaggeration of change and discontinuity on both sides is hiding underlying continuities. This is particularly so in the case of Ukraine. And with me to shed light on exactly what is the same, or what are the continuities and what are the discontinuities, are two excellent guests. Professor Richard Sakwa is a longtime scholar of Russia, of the former Soviet Union, the Ukraine conflict, and the changing world order as a whole. That is the subject of his latest book, The Culture of the Second Cold War. He has also written Frontline Ukraine, which came out in 2022, The Lost Peace, which has come out since. And interestingly, earlier, he wrote a book called Deception, and it was all about exposing the many entangled myths around Russiagate. So welcome, Richard.
My pleasure. Great to be back with you.
Great. And we also have, of course, Professor Mick Dunford, a frequent and very popular guest of Geopolitical Economy Hour. Mick is encyclopedically informed about everything from China to Russia to Ukraine to Europe, the West as a whole, and the world economy. So welcome back, Mick.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you for an over-generous introduction.
Not at all overgenerous. But let me just lay out what I think we'll be talking about. But of course, you guys will have your own ideas and take it in other places. But here goes. So if there is one continuity that I want to emphasize to start off our conversation, it is that today more than ever, Ukraine appears to be a stage on which a whole series of non-Ukrainian actors are performing more or less obscene vaudeville acts that have nothing to do with the security or the well-being of that hapless country and its citizens. This was true when President Biden was leading European governments to incite Ukraine to war against a neighbor that it had every reason and incentive to live peacefully beside. The real goals that Biden and the West were pursuing were many and varied. They included realizing the West's dream of dismembering Russia by making Ukrainians do the fighting, providing lucrative contracts to arms manufacturers and other corporations, supporting what was essentially a futile war effort, stabilizing political establishments throughout the West by enabling them to persecute and silence their opponents more effectively, and grabbing productive assets in Ukraine that the Klein Zelensky government was offering at war-deflated bargain basement prices. There are also signs that among the objective was changing the historical narrative in such a way as to legitimize fascism as the strongest force opposing communism and opposing Russia, both of which are being re-demonized in the West with great vigor today. that the war was destroying Ukraine, leading much of its youth to either emigrate or become fatalities or casualties on the battlefield, destroying what remained of its political institutions and structures already weakened by decades of oligarchical power, and bankrupting it hardly mattered. With the arrival of the Trump administration, only the acts have changed. That's it. The Trump administration, whether it is to demonstrate the president's much bragged about deal making skills, or in pursuit of the elusive Nobel Peace Prize that had already, during Trump's first term, led to the diverting antics vis-a-vis North Korea. Therefore, the Trump administration is simply seeking a cessation of the war that had to cease even if we had a Harris presidency. So this is an open question. Over the past year or more, Russia had simply changed too much on the ground for any other outcome to be possible. Most of Europe, however, is acting horrified and shocked at the alleged U-turn of the Trump administration, as it must, because the continuation of the war in Ukraine seems to be absolutely critical to maintaining the power of European establishments against their own insurgent right-wing forces. This is particularly clear in Germany today, as a not-so-grand coalition between the two established parties has abolished the debt brake that will, it is supposed, allow Germany to spend more, whether on supporting Ukraine, as is being loudly proclaimed, or whether to make European imperialism more autonomous from an increasingly unpredictable United States. As President Macron grandly offers fellow Europeans France's nuclear umbrella, as if they needed it, or as if it would suffice it if they did, only one thing is clear. Stocks in European defense sector corporations are soaring. So that's what I wanted to say as a background, and maybe we'll just start our conversation with Richard. You perhaps can take over from here and tell us what you think the Trump administration is really up to in Ukraine and what the expostulating liberal press is getting wrong.
Well, on the last point, almost everything, but thank you for that introduction. I'd like to maybe put things into a larger context because this year we're meeting now, 2025. We're literally almost to the day, the 40th anniversary of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev coming to power, the beginning of perestroika, and the opening up a whole new phase, or what we all like to think of as a much more open historical epoch, the end of the First Cold War. And a potential, as you mentioned, the Lost Peace book, the potential of a positive peace order. And this positive peace order was going to be built on the foundations established 80 years ago. Another anniversary we're celebrating this year, 80th anniversary of the end of the war, both in Europe initially in May, and then, of course, in Japan and in Asia. So 80th anniversary. And of course, 1945 was a moment of, well, I still like to talk of the spirit of 1945, which was the establishment of the United Nations, the adoption of the UN Charter as an element, a patrimony, if I can use that word, the belongs to all of humanity. Those principles, of course, not perfect, but it's the best we could do at that time. And I think the best we can do probably now. If only we could live up to those, it wouldn't be a bad thing. Now, so it's a moment of, as it were, anniversaries, and we've now entered another open historical moment. And so it's important. 80 years ago, 40 years ago, now, year naught, if you like, year zero of a whole new historical epoch. And of course, it's associated with Trump, but he reflecting far deeper currents which have been there for a long time. I mean, one can compare Trump initially, just in terms, even to Mao Zedong, as the evaluation in China is 70% good, 30% bad. I'd probably put it the other way around, 30% good, 70% bad. But it's, in a sense, to reflect that Trump is asking some of the right questions. Sometimes he may even get some of the right answers, but he's asking the question which should have been asked far more firmly 30, 40 years ago. What is the point of NATO and a Western military alliance system when its object against which it was established, i.e. the Soviet Union, and the ideological framework in which it was purposed in terms of the struggle against communism versus capitalism, put most crudely, is over. So what was the point? Instead of which, that alliance system perpetuated itself, and in so doing, it perpetuated Cold War attitudes, neo-containment against Russia, and of course, illusions of primacy globally and dominance, if you like, all of that, and of course, the subservience of Western European powers to the United States, to Washington's strategic and political concerns. What Trump is doing is questioning that, of course, NATO and all of that, which I certainly welcome. I've always been of the view that there can be no security unless it's all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Gorbachev's idea, the common European home. And it's not just that, de Gaulle's idea and Francois Mitterrand's idea. And of course, it's the aspiration of many neo-Gaullists today in France. As you probably heard, Dominique de Villepin, I think, is hoping to ballot in the next presidential election on behalf of the Républicains, which is again one of his positions is rapprochement with Russia. So it's quite clear that things are moving. But the just final point is that in the terms of this balance, you could say that Trump is doing a Gorbachev type thing, Trump's perestroika, if you like, Trump changing it. And of course, we know how perestroika ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So potentially, of course, there's collapses on the horizon. But more disturbing for me is that while junking, if you like, or threatening the existence of this political West, this Atlantic power system, or whatever, which perpetuated after 1989, which I welcome. What I do not welcome is that in ditching that bathwater, he is in danger of throwing out that baby, which is the Charter International System, United Nations, international law, multilateralism, and all those good things, World Health Organization, and other common endeavors, multilateral endeavors to deal with those challenges facing humanity, including the Paris Climate Accord and so on. So it's that constant mix between the agenda of 40 years ago, perestroika, good and bad, and of course the agenda of changing the very foundation of our international system, the world we live in, of 80 years ago. So it's a very open, as I say, historical moment. Very exciting to live through it, but of course very disturbing because there's so much damage which can be done. But also, my fear, of course, is that there's such weak, like popular engagement, and we're allowing, irresponsible elites, above all in Europe, who've got the stature of, how can I put it, not Churchillian, let's put it this, or not Gaullist, in fact, quite the opposite, to take the agenda, which are. And where's the popular movement? Where are the peace movements? Where's the World Council of Churches? Where's all of that, which can actually, trade unions even, engage and put pressure on our, what I regard, irresponsible elites? So I think that's a little bit the context.
No, that's great. But Mick, I saw you shaking your head at a certain point. I'm sure you want to jump in.
I listened to the comment about Mao Zedong, and I completely disagree. But
yeah. No, it was just quoting. I'm not saying I endorse that perspective.
You said you would reverse the percentages.
Yeah, sure.
I think I want to start with this issue of the international order, the United Nations order. I mean, that is an order that is very strongly supported by virtually all nations in the world, but it's actually centered on the principle of the equality of nation states. It is, in fact, in a sense, a kind of multipolar order in which all states, large and small, have equal status and equal rights. So, I want to stress, the Chinese have a completely different conception of multipolarity, from the United States, and indeed from this kind of Western world that shaped, the world that we've lived in, for the last 80 years, actually for the last 500 years, ever since the start of European colonialism. So Marco Rubio, he said two striking things recently. First of all, he said that the unipolar order has come to an end. So that is absolutely clear. He also indicated that the Ukraine war is actually a US proxy war with Russia. So it's quite striking, that he's acknowledged these two characteristics of the conflict that we have been living through. The question that arises in my mind is, what are the motives that explain the stance initially of the United States and also currently of Europe, which is very strongly resisting any movement in the direction of a peace settlement and seems to want to continue the conflict. Often Europe speaks about our values. And in fact, I mean, Europeans actually have a sense that they are in some sense a superior civilization and that they have the right, to in a sense extend or expect the rest of the world to accept their view of the ideal forms of economic and political organization and to establish those forms of economic and political organization on other countries. Now, the question is that simply a question of values, or is it in fact a reflection of interests? And what I would suggest, I mean, at present, for example, what one should do is look at the International Monetary Fund's balance of payments data. If you look at the G7, you find that overall they have a very, very large structural trade deficit. So in a sense, they spend far more than they actually earn through trade. So the question is, if you have a large structural trade deficit, how do you balance your accounts? And the way they balance their accounts is, of course, by large net inflows on the capital account. So they can print money, and then other countries will purchase their debt. But maybe in future, it's going to be more difficult to sell their debt to other countries, which puts them in a more very vulnerable position. They can acquire assets throughout the world that generate revenue streams that bring in capital flows into these countries. Now that they can control key technologies and they can appropriate the rents, associated with the high prices that they can charge, for example, for pharmaceuticals. And they can implement a system of trade rules which ensures that they are in a sense protected in the case of pharmaceuticals from producers with generic drugs. So what I'm suggesting is that Europe, in a sense, depends upon a set of resource transfers that it's seeking to preserve. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, in the 90s, Russia was plundered. When Putin came to power, he, in a sense, stopped the plunder. Europe still speaks about the need to break up Russia. I mean, we can look at what Britain's been doing recently in terms, if you look at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, this strategy that they're developing for the privatization of maybe 11,000 state-owned companies in Ukraine. Again, this is an attempt, if you like, to seek external revenues to sustain a relatively privileged position of the Western world. And it's in a sense imposed on them because they have embarked since the 1970s on a path of deindustrialization. I could come back and say more about the case of Britain. I mean, it's extraordinary. 8% of GDP comes and value added now only comes from manufacturing industry. It has a service economy, but that service economy is associated with exceptionally low productivity, with the sole exception of the City of London. The City of London, accounts for something near 20% of British GDP. Well, London itself, huge share. So this is in a sense a society, that is very vulnerable, but it's actually dependent upon a set of privileged relationships with other parts of the world. And I think that what's happening is that some of those are becoming unraveled, with the rise of China, with the reassertion of Russia, with the rise of the BRICS and so on. And I think that to some extent, certainly for Biden, it was an attempt to, if you like, reimpose a US-led rules-based order. I think Trump's decided that conflict with Ukraine and Russia is lost. But I mean, that's my sense. I do think you need to think about what are the motives that underpin the stance of Europe and the United States.
Yeah, that's, I mean, absolutely fascinating set of reflections from both of you about, really what recent developments show about the way the world order has been changing for a much longer time. But maybe I can request us all now to focus really much more on the concrete situation in Ukraine. I mean, Trump came to office saying, I'm going to end the war on the first day. In fact, the first day after my election, before even he was sworn in, he said he was going to end the war. And I, at least, my own analysis, I feel that the war would have ended even if Harris had won, because it has been lost by the West. As you rightly pointed out, Mick, that Rubio said it is the West's war, the US's war against Russia. It has already been lost. So it would they were just waiting for the election so that they wouldn't have to admit defeat in the run up to the election. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, I'm not sure, given the capriciousness with which Trump has been behaving, that he is really capable of achieving peace. So maybe we can again go to Richard and then Mick. What do you think? I mean, as you know, today there are these meetings taking place in Saudi Arabia today and over the next couple of days, I guess, between the Americans, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and so on. What do you think it's going to produce? And do you think we will actually see an end of the war? And if so, what will it look like?
Yeah, the Trump's moves towards ending the war is much criticized on the grounds that it's giving away everything before even negotiations start, which is rather absurd since what he's done, as you suggest, is a recognition of reality of what's actually
Mhm.
happening. So it's amazing how the Western public discourse, political discourse, is so often disassociated from what we would recognize as reality. And it's actually quite frightening. The all the posturing you mentioned, President Macron's speech of the 5th of March, which was, a very powerful call to arms. Friedrich Merz, Chancellor in waiting, has done exactly the same, talking about up to billions, 800 billion, and Ursula von der Leyen. So Europe is mobilizing for war at the time when Trump is trying to move towards peace. He's been condemned, of course, of appeasement, again, another Munich. But of course, the situations are utterly different because in Chamberlain was trying to avert the start of a war, whereas Trump is trying to put an end to one which has been going on far too long. And I think his sympathy when he talks about the tens of thousands of boys and women killed, he seems to be genuinely emotionally engaged in this because there is, even though, as you say, Trump is a highly volatile character in all sorts of ways, there is a deep Trump with certain enduring principles, some good, some bad. On tariffs, he seems to be obsessed with it. He was against Japan in the 1980s and all the way to today. But the other deep thing about Trump is his horror of war. Surprisingly enough, it is, in particular, nuclear war. Remember a few weeks ago, he talked about cutting China, Russia, and the United States should cut arms expenditure by half. So, in a sense, that business approach, which Mick has just talked about, it has a political reality, and that is, in a sense, the actual economic basis of that. Maybe we will critique it, but nevertheless, the fundamental idea, let's work on development, economy, and so on, rather than war. But so you're absolutely right that it's there's talks going on. Whether you say that, I mean, Ukraine has lost, that's for sure. Whether Russia or anybody else has won is far from certain, because there's this long tradition, and this is one thing which would make peace so difficult now, is that Russia tends to win wars and then lose the peace. And if you speak to Russian politicians, elite commentators, and so on, they constantly refer, if you mention that concept, they immediately think of San Stefano in 1878, a deal which, of course, gave Russia the eastern part of Anatolia, which would have meant Armenia united, would have avoided the mass murder genocide of Armenians during the First World War, and so much else. Britain ended up with Cyprus at the Congress of Berlin, even though it wasn't a belligerent in that war. And so, in a sense, that larger historical uh, moment hangs heavy over any peace process at the moment. And that is why the idea of the British and French putting on 10,000, 20,000, however many troops to police some sort of line of contact is simply unacceptable to Russia. So the idea that you can have NATO forces in Ukraine through the back door, which is precisely why they started the war in the first place. So Russia started the war, of course, but it was provoked by long-term actions, including NATO enlargement. And of course, NATO enlargement, Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon, but Ukraine was not in NATO, but NATO was definitely in Ukraine and doing all sorts of things. So just bottom line, Obviously, we all welcome, I think, peace discussions, peace negotiations, and that Trump has insisted that it has to be on the agenda. And this is what angered them so much when they met Zelensky in the White House with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio on, I think it was the 28th of February, because basically it was clear what came after 30 odd minutes of discussions that Zelensky was not ready for peace talks. And more than that, his relitigation, as Vance put it, of the whole history of the last 10 odd years was a false one. And Vance knew it perfectly. First of all, the idea of relitigating it, and second, in doing so in such a dishonest and mendacious manner. We're talking about the Normandy meeting in Paris in December 2019. He said there were no prisoner exchanges. We have pictures of him with prisoner exchanges on the 29th of December 2019, and so on. So it's going to be really tough. It's going to be really tough. Bottom line, why are the Europeans, Mick talked about motives, why are the Europeans so intent? I mean, Trump doesn't want to own this war. And why are the Europeans so intent on Europeanizing a war when they should be actually putting an end to a war on our continent, our European continent? So it's going to be really tough, really hard. So I mean, 50% pessimistic, if I can use the earlier formula, 70% pessimistic, 30% idea that perhaps there's a chance.
Your thoughts, Mick?
Um, maybe I'll just comment on something that Chas Freeman said. I mean, he spoke about two very different interpretations. One interpretation he spoke about was the case of when Sadat went to Israel in 1977, and essentially, you know, accepted that in a way he had irrevocably lost, and that it had to come to some kind of settlement. And Freeman said that this is the kind of parallel, that the US and the Western world have, in a sense, lost, and that they need to recognize that they have done so and come to terms. Now, I mean, Freeman put that forward against a different account, which said that the United States is seeking, to pull Russia back into a kind of better relationship with the United States. So it's in a sense trying to pull Russia away in particular from China. And it's doing that, as a kind of prelude, to a potential conflict with China. So there are these sort of very radically different interpretations, of what the United States is doing. On the one hand, it's acknowledging that, in a sense, the conflict in Ukraine is lost, and to some extent it has to come to terms with Russia. And on the other hand, what is happening is that there's an attempt to pull Russia away from China as a prelude to a conflict with China. So I mean, those are two radically different interpretations, that are being presented about this conflict. And Freeman was actually responding to this second one, namely that it's an attempt to pull Russia away, and he was saying it's much more, an acknowledgement that in fact that course is, in a sense, sort of failed, and that the West actually has to come to terms with it. But those are two quite radically different interpretations.
So, yeah, I mean, I just find it a bit difficult personally, I have to say, to believe that there is any deep that Trump has any depth at all, personally. And I see much more all this posturing, both around tariffs as well as around Ukraine and wars more generally, as a way of essentially, maintaining his support among Americans, because essentially he has won his election by claiming on the tariff front, of course, that the woes of ordinary Americans do not arise from 40 years of neoliberalism, but from China, from trade, etc. And therefore, all these tariff shenanigans, which of course are shenanigans, because, apart from the tariffs imposed on China, he's just been going flipping and flopping on every other measure that he has. And there's going to be a lot of opposition from within. But to come back to Ukraine, I think that, I've always thought that the term isolationism, American isolationism, is really simply a reflection of the fact that ordinary Americans never did want to go to war. And so, and what Trump is doing is simply, in a certain sense, appealing to this current of opinion, which is against war and so on. And also, historically, the United States has also preferred to get what it wants without having to fight. So, because it takes too much money and blood and treasure, so to speak. And so, if you can get it without fighting a war, why not? Because ultimately, it's, to go back to what you were saying, Mick, and I suppose I also referred to it earlier, we're talking about maintaining what are essentially a set of imperial relationships. Previously, the Europeans and the Americans cooperated in doing this. Can they really stop their cooperation in maintaining it, particularly at a time when their collective power is actually reduced rather than increased, and so on? So, but I still want to come back to this whole issue. Do you think that Trump that Trump wants to create peace, or that Trump will be able to create peace in the current conflict? Like you said, Richard, that you were 30% optimistic and 70%. So I mean, what do you think Trump might be able to achieve, and what do you think he will not be able to achieve?
That, if I may, in answering that question, go back to that Gorbachev analogy. What was so fascinating and astonishing in the late 1980s that it was the Russia which left, as it were, defected from the Soviet Union. No one expected that. We all expected the Georgians, the Estonias, etc., Lithuanians to do so. But it was a center, in other words, left its own heartland to re-establish a new relationship under Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. And so, in a sense, I'm now pushing that analogy with Trump. That's under Trump, the United States is leaving its own alliance system. Obviously, not Japan, not South Korea at the moment. But we're talking about the NATO alliance, the Atlantic alliance, and saying to Europeans, I mean, whether they actually physically leave NATO or not, we don't know. I don't think they probably will because it's too valuable. But certainly leaving it in part, certainly, and so their old emotional commitment to Western European defence is going. So that analogy. Can I go back to give the picture, picking up on what you said and what Mick said about the first statement, which I agree completely with, and that is, to analyse what's going on now, the Trumpian phenomenon, or the Trumpian disruption, is the three levels. Mick talked about, absolutely rightly, that the United Nations is in itself, by its very essence, a normative framework for multipolarity. 193 states today, sovereign, equal, and they're based on a vision of sovereign internationalism. Genuine multilateralism, of course, it fails in achievement, but the principle is there. The second thing, of course, is that you had then a US-led order, which what I call a political West, and Mick talked about some of its economic dimensions a minute ago, that this framework is not for internationalism as such. It's that model of globalism. And what Trump is doing today is rejecting both that that charter-based internationalism, the sovereign internationalism, and the US-led globalism of the old sort, which was democratic globalism. The whole world has to look like the United States, end of history ideology, all of that nonsense. So he's repudiating that. And in some of the old ways in which the economy worked, I mean, you maybe elaborate, but just in very basic terms. So pushing back against old-fashioned multilateral internationalism, against Davos-type globalism, which, of course, by disrupting some of those mechanisms. But then what is he doing? You could say, is it a return simply to anarchy? Is it a return to great power politics? It's not isolationism. It's but it's not international. It's not globalism. So it's mercantilism, of course. But so obviously we can elaborate that in political economy terms, which you guys are the great experts on that. But still, so in other words, we know what it's not, but I'm not entirely sure what word I could use. Yes, it's definitely, I agree with both of you. It's a continuation of empire by other means, and so it's no longer got that vision that the whole world has. Like, they don't care as long as you bow to American will. And one final point. So Mick mentioned absolutely right. There's much discussion today that what's going on is a reverse Nixon, against vis-a-vis going to China in the early 1972 and so on. But clearly the situation is very different. Then at that stage, Russia and China or Soviet Union were at daggers drawn, and that obviously is not the case now. And just to say that my view is, despite obviously many tensions between Russia and China, that their alignment, it's not an alliance, it's an alignment, is deep, profound, and enduring. And it isn't just a question of a very deep and clear, obvious, personal warmth between Xi Jinping and Putin. I've met how many times? I've lost count, 35, 37. And of course, they're due to meet at least twice this year. I don't know whether Xi Jinping will attend the 9th of May victory parade in Moscow, but he's been invited, and vice versa. Putin has been invited to China to celebrate the end of the Sino-Japanese war over the other side. And that's amazing. That's huge. So, but that will continue. So that is one of the pillars of international politics today, is that alignment. Tensions, of course, all sorts of issues, understandably. But it is absolutely wrong to consider Russia a vassal of China or any of that sort of classic American Washington speak, where it's always about sort of who's top dog and so on. In fact, because as Mick said, China thinks about foreign policy, international politics in a different way. It's not just simply repeating Cold War. The very idea of Cold War, the very idea of bloc politics is anathema to them. It's a different way of thinking about international politics, which, for good or ill, but much of it is good in terms of both Russia and China appealed to the Charter, of course, obviously more in the breach than the implementation quite often. But nevertheless, it's fundamentally important because that's their normative base. There's a strong normative basis to that alignment, as well as economic and military. Military in the sense that they've got a 6,000-kilometer border, and the last thing they want is to militarize that when they have to face common protagonists, obviously Washington and others in the world at large. So I think that's a framework. But as I said, what Trump represents, and a nice, concise word. But I'm a great believer in nominative determinism. If we can find a word, then we know where we are.
Mick, can you supply this word?
Yeah, I mean it's the reverse Nixon thesis is the one that Chas Freeman was reacting against. But I mean, I agree absolutely, that the circumstances today are profoundly different from those that prevailed, in 1971. That cleavage actually, very interestingly, started in 1954, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin. It was what Zhou Enlai said to Bush and Kissinger, when they met in 1971, because they asked him, when the conflict with the Soviet Union started. So, the solution of the difficulties between the United States and China waited until 1971, so a long time, but after a long period of difficult relationships between China and Russia, Soviet Union. I think it's very striking, that recently, Wang Yi has said that it's very important to move to negotiations and to find a settlement to this conflict. But then he also said, a 1 meter block of ice does not freeze in one day, nor does a block of ice melt in one day. So he was talking about the difficulties, that confront any attempt to resolve this particular conflict. And then he also went on to say that the roots, the causes are extremely complex. And that is actually quite important, because I think in starting to see the Chinese now say that the causes of the conflict are extremely deep and very complex, that will perhaps lead to a sort of much more realistic assessment of the possibilities of finding a way out. I think I mean, I think Richard's obviously written a very great deal that's extremely important about the roots of this conflict, which we haven't really talked about at all. But it's only really, as the Russians say, it's only by addressing the roots and removing the root causes of this conflict that one can actually address it. And that has to do, with broader security issues in Eurasia, as well as the situation in Ukraine itself. So I think these are aspects of the problem, that are just, too often pushed to one side with these kind of simple claims, about Russian aggression versus, the defense of a democratic country against an aggressive imperialist power. So I think that's quite important, because only if you start to grapple with the complexity of this issue, can one start to think about the ways in which one can really find a solution. But
Yeah.
I mean, in relation to what Trump is doing, I've always been inclined to this kind of idea that he wants, to some extent, to pull Russia away from China if he can. But he also, I think the United States is very worried about certain things. I mean, it's obviously very worried about the dollar and the position of the dollar. So that in these meetings in Riyadh, apparently that was one of the questions, that was raised, by the United States that they wanted to discuss. They also wanted to discuss Iran because they see Iran as supporting forces, if you like, that are run counter, to the U.S. position in relation to the Middle East and its support for Israel. So there are issues on a global scale, that Trump feels and his group probably feel that they need to address. And I think that what is happening partly reflects this concern with these international issues. But I mean, obviously, he needs to address these international issues because he's still got a lot of problems at home, enormous problems. I mean, there's a lot of huge political opposition, in the Democrats, but also in his own party. And there are a whole series of social and economic problems, deep-seated social and economic problems with the infrastructure in the United States. And I mean, clearly, to live in a kind of multipolar world, Europe and the United States, they in a sense have to reindustrialize. They have to change their development path so that they can operate effectively with other countries in a cooperative way, in a more harmonious and actually more equal, world system. So it's a moment. I mean, to me, it's a moment of very profound, potentially very, very profound change in the world, and possibly opening the door to the movement in the direction. Who was this? Talked about a commonwealth of civilizations. Of a world that is varied, that respects the variety of civilizations, that respects the choices that people in different parts of the world make up of their own development paths, and insists on cooperation and discussion and negotiation to resolve conflicts between them. So I think, a lot of what is happening, in Ukraine is a struggle that in a sense is trying to push, in the direction of a rather different world system, and one that, hopefully could be more peaceful. I mean, actually, if I just say, I'm very struck, we talked about these concepts of international order, China was basically at peace for 500 years until 1894. East Asia was at peace for 300 years. Europe, well, 100 years peace. But basically in that period, it was colonizing Africa. So this is about a different, it's an attempt to build a different kind of world. And I mean, personally, I think this is what China is pushing for. And that's what, in this kind of dialogue with the BRICS and so on, that's what they're pushing for. But I mean, there's this kind of resistance to it, very strong resistance to it in Europe. Maybe Trump has recognized, some of the realities of the situation and is trying to come to terms with it. But, basically, I find him unfathomable because he will say one thing one day and another thing another day.
Well, maybe the word that you were looking for is unfathomable. But let me let me also say that I've been and I've said this in writing as well. It seems to me that, to go back to the point I made earlier in response to your point, Richard, that, is there a deep Trump? Is there some kind of a rational kernel to what he's doing? And I really don't think there is. And part of the reason is that at a certain level, even if Trump had any kind of philosophy or strategy, it wouldn't matter because the very election of Trump to the presidency the second time and the first time expresses the fact that it expresses a deep crisis in the United States, a deep crisis of its politics, a deep crisis of its economy, a deep crisis of its imperialism, etc., etc. And in my view, Trump can only express this crisis. Trump and his actions and his words can only express this crisis in various ways. The contradictory things that he says one thing one day and it's opposite another day and so on, is simply an expression of the contradictory forces buffeting his administration, both domestically and internationally. Further, I would say that this idea that on the whole question of promoting peace and is he really opposing the globalist position? I really doubt it. I think again he's not opposing it. He's expressing the fact that it is exhausted. And so, for example, if he were really against globalism, then he should not be openly declaring that the dollar system must be preserved, because the dollar system is the keystone of America's globalism. It is the principal way in which it acts like this, giant sort of vacuum cleaner, vacuuming up value from all over the world and pouring it into the rich countries, particularly the United States. So he cannot want to destroy it. I think, as I say, so that's what I'd like to suggest, is that really Trump is expressing the crisis, would be my way. It's not one word, it's three words, or whatever. But expressing the crisis is the way I would put how to understand Trump. But I wonder what you folks think. And also I had one other point I wanted to make. Again, both of you touched on the whole question of Europe. And Richard, you mentioned that Dominique de Villepin is going to run for the presidency in France whenever the elections are, I don't know. That's really interesting. But to what extent do you think that such forces, I mean, what are the obstacles in their way to becoming the dominant force in France? And is a Gaullist position really the kind of position that the world needs in order to create the sort of world order that, again, both of you were talking about, that China would like to create, and so on and so on?
Yeah. No, excellent points. I just say that on this globalism, yes, I've been, I'm trying to work through it, and so I think you've put it very well in that he expresses the crisis, like I put it, in the sense he asks the right questions, but obviously his answers are deeply flawed. But in that sense, yes, I remember thinking about it, that he's, as you say, he's not against globalism, but what you could say, he's trying to rethink it. So it's moving away from the classic, let's call it hegemonic globalism that has dominated since 1945 and described in economic terms we've just heard. So he's shifting from hegemonic globalism to, I mean, I was going to say imperial globalism, but it was always empire. So I'm not quite sure whether just simply anarchic globalism, less rules-based ordered, but that's a sort of, again, searching for a word. But you're probably right. Let's not, it is globalism by other means. So that's the first point. The second one, to go back to what Mick said, again, what we're talking about, Russia, China, it is, so Russia, US. What Trump does want, and that is in a sense, there's, okay, maybe not a deep Trump, but certain consistency in positions. And one of them has been the need for rapprochement. Not detente, a rapprochement with Russia. That's been a very long time position, even back to the Soviet Union, by the way, and the vision that Moscow and Washington really don't have any fundamental divisions. Russia, maybe in the Soviet times, different, but obviously today, Russia is not a peer competitor. It's, geographically distant and very little economic interaction and so on. Maybe more should be mutually beneficial. Indeed, to push it away from China. But that would be, as I said, that's not going to work. But the larger question is, you talked about the spirit. China was at peace for 500 years. I think that's magnificent vision. And today, one of the forms which it takes is the spirit of ASEAN, 10 countries in
Mm,
Association for Southeast Asian
yeah.
Nations, some big, some small, some communist, some capitalist, and so on. Laos was country in
Mm,
chair last year. And it's very explicit. The ASEAN way is peace, development, reconciliation, talking, dialogue, and so on. And China is obviously very close to that, the spirit of ASEAN, and so on. So I think that's important. Whereas this Western spirit is constant about hierarchy, it's about dominance, it's
yeah.
about expropriation, exploitation, bloc politics, evil empires, and just dreadful the debasement of our political discourse,
Yeah.
which of course is reflected in every single daily. It's almost impossible to read the mass media and watch it in the UK. I don't know about anywhere else. So, but as you say, this idea, I just want to feed in one word because you say I'm a nominative determinist, and that is the word Dagmar Wimmick said. Comity, COMITY, not committee, the Comity
Mm,
of Nations. And that's a great word because it's not just about cooperation, but really a community of nations. And I think that picks up on some Chinese thinking on foreign policy today. And going back to 1945, when China, of course, was a founder member of the United Nations, the Charter System. Final point on Europe. Well, it leaves me utterly bewildered in the sense why they're so keen on, and obviously the transformation of the European Union
mm,
from a welfare community to a warfare community is absolutely mind-blowing to watch it.
yeah.
The language of Ursula von der Leyen, you listen to it, it's so full of hate, so full of violence, so full of degraded political sloganeering. And of course, the fact that she appointed Kaja Kallas, a former prime minister
Mm,
of Estonia, as I thought it was a joke when she was nominated as the High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. I really did. Then people
mm,
tell me in Brussels, you think that's bad. They actually were going to get somebody from Lithuania who was even more jaw-droppingly Russophobic, militant, war hawkish, and so on. The whether the entire NATOization of the European Union is one of the great historical developments of our time, and whether the Républicains or Dominique or whoever in France can stand against it. We talked about the German election and the fact that Die Linke, interesting, as we said, 8% in the German elections,
mm,
yet those people, the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht people, did have a little push. I used the word surge when we talked earlier. It wasn't. It was a little push. They nearly got there,
mm,
4.97%. Of course, they're appealing it,
mm,
so they may find some votes, but so close. And the point is that BSW, Sarah Wagenknecht, was the really only serious, consistent anti-war position from the left.
Absolutely.
So that's why, particularly
mm,
with Die Linke, is far more diffuse on that position. So whether there is Gaullism is not the answer by any means, but certainly not in domestic politics, but in terms of thinking about pan-continental issues, it's certainly that Gaullist contribution. And Mitterrand, of course, talked about Confederation of Europe as well. So that long tradition, and Bismarck's vision in a very different way, all the way back. The secret of security in Europe is a good treaty with Russia,
Yes.
was his slogan. And of course, it was
mm,
right. And when they ditched it, when he was ditched, 1890, um, it went downhill from there.
mm,
Was just one final point, and that is, of course, the Franco-British Entente again, Entente cordiale. Basically, it has never betokened anything good. It
Yes.
didn't, because they then, invaded, attacked the Crimean War in the
mm,
1850s, 1853, which included basically British naval maneuvers in the Baltic Sea, Island Islands, and so on. Then, of course, the Entente was one of the precipitating factors for the First World War. And of course, in the Second World, very different, very different. But, I'm not sure that this Entente, based on such bizarre principles, you listen to Macron's speech, so many falsehoods in that 15-minute odd
mm,
speech. It was just bizarre. And of course, Starmer preparing for war. No vision that let's not prepare for war. Let's try to create the conditions in which we don't need to securitize our continent, to militarize it, go back to a Cold War. I mean, worse than Cold War, even. It's so astonishing. So the bankruptcy, the recklessness of the European leadership today is just mind-boggling.
And I think, if I may just say, one barometer of that bankruptcy is the contempt with which Angela Merkel is treated these days, not because of her policy of allegedly appeasing Russia. And I think this is a very interesting. Her biography has come out, and the way it's being discussed is it's pretty awful. But anyway, Mick, I'm sure you want to add something, and then I have one last question. We should be winding down, but I have one very important last question.
Well, I mean, first, I mean, Richard just made a series of extremely important points, very significant points. I, want to emphasize that. I consider, what he just said exceptionally important. I think, I mean, Europe, I mean, one cannot, in some ways, but be baffled. I mean, to me, to think about increasing your defense expenditure to 5% of GDP with all its implications for welfare, but also its implications for, if Europe were to embark on reindustrialization, for reindustrialization. Do you want to reindustrialize around war industries? Do you want to lift the German debt brake in order to be able to expend large amounts of money on armaments, possibly importing equipment from the United States, as Poland has chosen to do? Or should you do that, to try and reverse the damage of the last, really, since the 1970s, with the exception of Germany? I mean, Germany had a very powerful industrial economy, and I mean, other European countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and so on, had significant presence in certain industrial sectors. But to me, that path, of deindustrialization followed by most European countries, the offshoring of industry, the movement into services, the movement into financial services, the financial speculation, were a path that may have done something to restore the profitability of Western capital for a while, but for the great mass of European people was a very, very damaging path. And what they, in this moment, what Europe should be thinking about doing is engaging in a discussion with Russia about resolving the security problem in Europe, the problem of indivisible security in Europe, going back to the issues that Lavrov tried to raise in December, 2021. Going back to that, and then, trying to understand the complexity of the situation in Ukraine. I still remember Gorbachev when he met Bush in 1990. He said, if Ukraine became an independent country in the borders of the Soviet Socialist Republic, it would be an unstable construct. And he went on to explain why that was the case. With 30% of the population is essentially ethnic Russian, well, not 30%, 23%, but 30% use Russian as a primary language. To try to impose a sort of Galician, a West Ukrainian concept of nationhood on a country that is essentially multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic is a serious problem. And I mean, it involves flagrant abuses of all of the fundamental concepts of democracy that Europe speaks about. So I think, Europe's got to, in a sense, come to terms with the sort of history of its own continent, and also, come to terms with this need to devote its resources to using the extraordinary skills of many of its people, in a sense, to rebuild its industries and assume a kind of equal place in the world alongside other countries. And I think many other countries, I mean, in Munich, it's very interesting. You see, Wang Yi gave a speech and he talked about the distinctiveness of the Chinese concept of multipolarity. But what he also did, he talked about the way in which the door for Europe is open. Yeah. He was encouraging the Europeans to come and talk and seek modes of cooperation. But that's not what the European current leadership does. And that is a terrible tragedy, and it has very bleak implications for Europe. I mean, even its industrial strength, of Germany is being eroded by virtue of the fact that it rejects, the use of Russian energy. Yet that's an obvious complementarity between Europe, which lacks energy, and Russia, which has enormous energy resources. So it's astonishing. I find it quite astonishing.
Well, a thing on which Bismarck and Angela Merkel were agreed at some point. But yes, on Europe, I really do feel that Europe's drive towards war is entirely political. It's based, or rather, it's entirely about preserving the power of the established elites in Europe. Because if they don't have war, they are not going to be able to essentially persecute their opponents as, Russophiles and anti-Semitic and all these sorts of things. And this level of political repression has allowed the political spectrum to be confined to the established parties and an insurgent right, which then must be prevented from coming to power so you can preserve your position. So I really feel that the commitment that Europe has over Europe comes from that. But let me also ask this last question, and I'll make this the last round, because really my question to you both is, how is Moscow looking at the current moment? What are the possibilities that it sees? What do you think Putin is thinking? What is the Moscow establishment thinking that can be gained? Because, as I said, it seems to me that I think they should be wary of any deal that the Americans sign, because they will sign it one day and tear it up the next. So what do you think?
Yeah, the recent today's even basically prohibiting Kalin Georgescu in Romania from fighting the presidential election is certainly seems to confirm Moscow's view that the West, and the argument, is systemically pursuing double standards. That its very essence is double standards. Is that when it was, our sort of people we work with, dictators and so on, when they're ours, a classic, goes all the way back to the whole pattern of politics since 1945. And of course, this is a stark reminder within Europe how we are, in building on what both of you have just said, undermining the very normative foundations of the European community. I'd always assumed in the old days that the European Union, was a peace project, but the fact to see it so transformed into a war project is the bitter disappointment to so many, and I'm surprised there's not been more public pushback. As for Moscow, of course, it just confirms all that you've said, all that we've said. Double standards, the failure to live up to our own views when they're inconvenient to the power elite, is just awful. And of course, the second thing is cannot trust the West, and that obviously Ukraine is an unstable entity. That's why they're saying that any deal with Zelensky, and there's some legitimacy to this argument, isn't hardly worth the paper it's written on, since effectively, technically, there should have been elections. He ran out, his office ended last May 2024. So, even though you could argue in wartime issues whether you can have an election or not, that doesn't matter. His successor will almost certainly say, well, he was no longer legitimate president, therefore we can renege on this deal. There will be this time. That's why no Minsk 3, a third Minsk. They feel they were betrayed the first two times. Of course, it's controversial, but the feeling that the West simply cannot, and indeed Merkel and Hollande explicitly said so. And so it's so it's going to be really hard. And going back to one of my first points, that the long-term vision that Russia wins the war but always loses the peace. Well, this time, and just final point is that Putin, is presented in the West as some sort of totalitarian dictator. Clearly, he's an authoritative leader with huge popular support, but he has his own internal constituencies. On the one side, the war bloggers, the Z bloggers, the militants, the hawks. On the other, the business community has actually spoken out. They want peace. And of course, as the people as well, opinion polls, Levada, show an overwhelming desire for peace, but it has to be on terms that justify the sacrifices that have been made. And so there's a lot of criticism of Putin that he's too soft, that he's going to sell out, that he's going to be charmed, wooed by Trump now in all this. Obviously, he's not going to renege on the Chinese alignment, but maybe he's going to give up too much to set, under Trump. So that's a sort of feeling. But all these 3 years, there has not been this vast vision in the West of the people incited against Ukraine, against the West, and so on. No, Russians are European. They just want to live in peace and to get on, what Mick said, peace and development. That's what really they wanted, and it's reflected in public opinion polls.
Mick?
Well, I mean, there was nearly a solution, in April?
Absolutely.
2022. No, I mean, Russia has been very clear what its terms are. Crimea, the four oblasts, Ukraine, never has a prospect of entering NATO, and then these demilitarization, denazification, and addressing, these discriminatory measures, against what large sections of the population of Ukraine, a large number of ethnic Russians who were left inside Ukraine once it became an independent state. Trump says he wants a ceasefire, but the Russians have said no ceasefire. It's because they've been deceived, so many times. I mean, Richard's written a book about deceit. They've been deceived so many times. Richard says that they lose the peace. So they do express absolute determination not to accept a ceasefire until the fundamental and very complex issues have actually been resolved. So that seems to be fairly clear. I mean, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually put out a statement 2 days ago, actually reasserting that in very, very strong words. I think there's the tension, therefore, with Trump, because Trump wants a quick ceasefire. And he's talked about preserving an independent Ukraine. I mean, how large a Ukraine does he want? He talks about a resource deal, with Ukraine. I mean, Putin responded. It was very interesting. He said, we're very, very happy to cooperate, with American companies in terms of developing the resources of the new parts of Russia. So a fair relationship, win-win relationship is obviously something that he's very open to in relation to that. But there's a certain degree of tension, between the Russians saying we want a long-term solution and Trump wanting a quick ceasefire. And Trump has actually said on 2 occasions that he would consider imposing sanctions on Russia if a ceasefire is not achieved. I think it's interesting, there have been several meetings with China recently, and I think it's obviously clear, from the words, that if there were new sanctions, China would stand, by Russia absolutely clearly. So I think Russia has actually resisted, the impact of sanctions. It's amazing how they coped, this reindustrialization program, all sorts of things, how they contain public debt, how they manage the deficit. It's quite astonishing, but I mean, in many senses, very productive. It indicates how a country can actually rebuild its industrial capacity. It's a lesson, for Europe. Look at it. Why can't we do that? Mm-hmm. So that's striking. But I think there's a difficulty coming to an agreement there, and then there's a second problem, and that is, without those 5 oblasts, the ethnic the Russian-speaking share of the remaining Ukrainian population is going to be smaller. How can one guarantee, in a world in which, political leaders change, how can one guarantee that you won't see a reemergence of these problems in Ukraine, because these have been, these have been terrible problems, for the last, the 8 years of the Civil War. And so, I mean, I very much wonder what Richard would say about that. Can you find a solution to these deeply rooted problems, that, I mean, were tragically exploited, terribly exploited, from the time when Ukraine became an independent country. I mean, it should have been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural country.
And multi-confessional. Yeah.
Multi-confessional, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it failed. It failed. With tragic consequences, absolutely tragic consequences.
Did you want to add anything, Richard?
No, I agree completely with that. It's really, there's many levels to this conflict, but we shouldn't forget the domestic Ukrainian one, the pan-European one, and then the US-Russian one is just one dimension to it. Yep. So like a Rubik's Cube, they need to be all lined up to get a sustainable, enduring peace order.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that underlines really well exactly the obstacles to peace in Ukraine. And I'm sure this is going to be a great background to anyone wanting to understand what is going to unfold in the coming weeks and months now that the Ukraine conflict has finally been placed on the Trump administration's agenda. So I will not add anything more. I think you two have done a great job. And so thank you very much for coming. We've been going for over an hour, so we'll wrap up here today. And thanks so much. And I'm sure we'll have lots of occasions to come back and discuss further stages in this process. So thank you, and see you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you.